Welcome to the Writers League of Texas podcast, conversations and presentations featuring writers and industry professionals talking about the craft and business of writing. More information about this discussion, including details on our panelists and presenters, can be found at writersleague.org. We hope you enjoy the discussion.
It is my pleasure to introduce first Becca Oliver. She joined the Writers League in 2013 as executive director after more than 16 years working in book publishing. She spent much of her publishing career inside two of the big five publishing leaders, Macmillan and Hachette Book Group, licensing domestic and foreign rights on behalf of countless notable authors, including Sandra Brown, Brad Meltzer, Nicholas Sparks, Jon Stewart, The Daily Show, and more. In 2007, she made the leap from associate director of subsidiary rights at Grand Central Publishing to literary agent, first at Endeavor, then at William Morris Endeavor, after the two powerhouse talent agencies merged in 2009. As a literary agent, Becca represented an array of award-winning and best-selling clients working in both fiction and nonfiction. Please welcome Becca Oliver. And she is joined by Writers League favorite. I'm going to stand over here so it doesn't do that. Lance Fitzgerald. He's the VP Director of Subsidiary Rights at Penguin Random House, overseeing rights sales for 450 books annually. He has over 2 decades experience in publishing, has worked with #1 New York Times bestselling authors, including former First Lady Michelle Obama, Presidents Barack Obama and George W. Bush, Andy Weir, Gillian Flynn, C.J. Box, Anthony Marr, and Deepak Chopra. He is a member of the International Rights Directors Advisory Board and has been a featured speaker at the New York Rights Fair, Authors and Artists Representatives, the Columbia and NYU Summer Publishing Courses, the Young to Publishing Group, the Writers League of Texas Agents and Editors Conference, which he credits with teaching him everything he knows about books and life. He wrote that, not me. And the Slice Writers Conference. Please welcome Lance Fitzgerald.
Hi, thank you for coming out tonight. It's nice and cool in here. We're going to learn some hot ideas. Anyway, I think the first thing to kind of understand is why us? Why are we the ones you should listen to about how to pitch? So we're going to talk a little bit about our pitching experience before we dive in. My role as subsidiary rights director, and for those of you who don't know, that's a department within a large publishing house. I'm at Penguin Random House. Our role is to license the rights for books that we publish to be used in other formats. And that could be to foreign publishers, it could be to the Book of the Month Club, it could be to a magazine. So what that means is my entire life is pitching. I'm constantly pitching to foreign publishers, I'm pitching to foreign editors, to magazine editors, audio publishers, talking about the books that we publish. I would say 75 to 80% of my job is pitching on a daily basis. How about you, B?
So I started in publishing doing the same sort of work that Lance Fitzgerald does. And then when I realized I could never reach the heights that he has reached, I became a literary agent. So as a literary agent, you know, one thing I think sometimes people forget is that agents also are pitching because they're the ones who are picking up the phone, calling editors, writing their version of a query letter, which would be their submission letter. And so I did that quite a bit, had to learn how to read a manuscript and figure out what the most interesting things about it were. But then I also received a lot of query letters. So I've seen query letters, and over time through both reading them and then writing them myself, I feel that I've learned a thing or two about how to talk about them.
You are all working very, very hard on projects. Maybe you've got projects that are finished. Maybe you've got multiple projects. You can't quite finish it. And I think one of the biggest things everyone kind of runs into is, how do I talk about my book? So that's what we're going to dive into tonight. And I think we'll just start with, what is the goal? We've talked about things we want to learn tonight. So what is the goal of the pitch we're going to work on tonight, Becca?
Yeah, so the goal of the pitch, and I think several of you alluded to it already, is to find a literary agent, find somebody who's going to take on your project, who's going to work with you, who's going to help you do all sorts of important things, but most importantly is going to be that gatekeeper that is able to then submit your book to publishers. So when you're thinking about pitching, that's usually, especially if you're going to, whether it's our conference or any other conference, or if you're in a situation where you're going to be talking directly to agents, or writing a query letter, because a query letter is also a pitch, that's the goal, right? But we also want you guys to think about a sort of secondary goal or a bonus to pitching, which is it can really help you understand your work better, and it can really help you answer some questions for yourself about what is the most compelling thing about this novel, about this memoir, about this narrative nonfiction I'm writing. Who are the most important characters? What is what is interesting about it? So you can sometimes end up recognizing certain challenges you may have by really examining your work and working to come up with a pitch. So we would encourage you to keep that in mind, because I think, as Michael alluded to, writers are out all the time, and you're just harmlessly trying to enjoy a barbecue. Someone asks you what you do, you say you're a writer, and they say,
What's your book about?
right, and you're like, So that's the kind of secondary. But of course, for this purposes of this evening, for the people who may be listening on the podcast who have received this recording, because we're sending it out to everybody who's attending the conference next weekend, we are here to talk about the pitch as a way to find an agent.
To find an agent, even beyond that, I think a good goal to have is, how do I get someone to want to read more or to read something? Because you'll be pitching. You won't be showing them any words, and your goal is to get them to think, yeah, I want to read that. So with that in mind, we're going to jump right in, and we're going to start by talking about what a pitch is not, because I think it's important to keep track of what a pitch isn't, because it'll help kind of narrow down what you should do. So I think, top of my head, a pitch is not a cast of characters.
A pitch is not a theme.
A pitch is not imagine a world.
A pitch is not a monologue.
A pitch should not be questions.
A pitch is not every question answered.
And I think this is the trickiest one of all. A pitch is not a synopsis.
And a pitch does not require the other person to do a lot of work.
I think so. Let's jump in back now. Now we're going to backtrack a little bit and talk a little bit about why these are not pitches. Because you may be thinking, well, a pitch is obviously a synopsis. What are you talking about? So to kind of go through the list again, a pitch is not a cast of characters. A cast of characters is a list of people in a book. That's not engaging. That's not going to draw someone in. If you're reading a novel and you open the first page and there's a list of 20 names, you're not focusing on that at that point. You'll refer back to it later, but that's not what's going to draw you in.
A pitch is not a theme. I think oftentimes, and wonderfully, in a lot of great books, theme emerges. Theme is a very important thing that the reader takes away. Theme is an important thing that the writer is thinking about either before or after the process. But theme is not going to circle you back to that goal of having somebody ask for more. So theme is something you can certainly be aware of and you can treasure, but we are going to suggest that that's not a pitch.
Theme is not imagine a world, because you should not be telling that agent or editor to imagine the world. You're going to lead them into the world through your writing.
And a pitch is not a monologue. So if you are ready to just stand there, if you're doing a one-on-one consultation at our conference, it's 10 minutes, which some people say, someone said to me the other day, oh my gosh, that's not a lot of time. I guarantee you that will be the longest 10 minutes of your life. And if you find yourself just ready to talk for 10 minutes straight, that's not a pitch.
And a pitch is not questions, because you are telling the agent and editor what your book is. You are not asking them what your book is or ask them to respond to something they don't know yet.
A pitch is not every question answered. So the idea, too, being that maybe there are some things you can tease in that pitch when you sit down initially. This is easier for in-person pitching. When you sit down initially, something you can tease that's then going to kind of bring on a dialogue, right? So it's something that they may ask you about. It's something that might turn into a real conversation, which I think the best, as an agent who attended a lot of conferences, I think the best and most satisfying consultation sessions are the ones where you actually have a back and forth with the person. So maybe there's something interesting that you can tease to leave them wanting to ask a question.
And a pitch is not a synopsis. I don't know about you, but if I go to the movies and I get a trailer for a movie and it shows the entire movie, I don't need to see it. So if you give the synopsis for your book, they don't need to read your book. You want to leave them wanting more.
And a pitch does not require the other person to do a lot of work. And what we mean by that is a pitch is intended to convey that information in a pretty straightforward way. So being vague or leaving sort of some very important pieces of it out is not going to help you with an agent. You don't want them to have to feel like they have to do a tremendous amount of work to understand what it is that you have written and that you're talking to them about.
And a pitch should be short. I think, going back to every question answered, a pitch should be short. You should leave them wanting more. I think once you've gone on too long, someone turns off and they don't want to hear it. That said, have backup. Be ready if that agent or that editor starts to ask you questions, be ready to answer. Be able to talk more about your book. You don't want to sit there and say, oh, they ask, well, tell me more about what happens. And you go, oh, that was my 3-minute pitch and I got nothing else. The thing to keep in mind is you wrote this book. You know this book better than anyone else on this planet, so you should feel very confident and proud to talk about it. So I think something to keep in mind, we've talked a lot about what a pitch is not. We're going to dive into, we have some props about what a pitch is, but I think something to keep in mind is a pitch is fluid. A pitch is ever changing. A pitch should never be set in concrete. It should never be that thing that you developed tonight or you developed a week ago and you're like, this is what you stick with. As I said, I pitch for a living. I attend 2 giant international book fairs every year, one in London and one in Frankfurt, Germany, where I have half-hour meetings, 9 to 6, every day with foreign publishers. And I sit down and I'm pitching the same book over and over and over. And if I'm not able to change my pitch to who I'm talking to, I'm going to fail at my job. So you have to be able to listen. And that pitch I give on Wednesday at the book fair is completely different from the pitch on Saturday, because I have picked out the nugget of like, oh, their eyes lit up when I used that word, when I said that phrase. Oh, they're excited about this. I need to talk about that. Oh, when I mentioned that the book was set on a highway in Utah, the Swedish publisher turned off because they can't relate to that, so I'm not going to bring that up again. So it's important things to remember. I know, having attended the Agents and Editors Conference a few times and just watching the pitches as they change over the course of that week is fascinating. I hope that when you attend the conference, or if you're not attending the conference, and you go to the genre sessions, and you go to the pitch lab, and maybe you go to a reception, and you go to have a one-on-one meeting with an agent if you're lucky enough, that you're able to fine-tune and tweak and make sure that that pitch is set like you need it to be. Talk to your fellow attendees. Can I practice my pitch on you? Practice it. What did you respond to? What really worked for you? What did you like? Always be willing to change.
So we're going to jump into a framework for pitching that is something we've talked about before, but we're going to really use it tonight in each of the examples that we have here. So it's something we call the 4 C's, and these are really an anatomy of a pitch. And the idea is that if you have all of these C's covered, if you know whether you need all of them, you're going to learn a little more about that. If you have them in your query letter, if you have them in your in-person pitch, and we'll talk a little bit more about which ones you might include an in-person pitch versus a query letter, then you're well on your way. So this is not meant to be, you have to do exactly what we're telling you, but I think if you really analyze your material and you think about it with the idea of these 4 C's, that it will help you a great deal as you figure out your pitch. So the 4 C's are connection, context, compel, and credentials. So for the purpose of tonight, we're focusing on the in-person, right? So all of these are applicable, as I said, to a query letter. Tonight, for the in-person, we are going to really focus on context and compel, because we believe that those are the 2, when you have a very short period of time and you're talking to someone directly, that you're going to want to really focus on. Okay, connection. So for the sake, when we say connection, what we mean is you are letting that agent know that you're not wasting their time, that you've done some research, that you, and this is in a query letter, or it can be in person, but we'll kind of circle back to that. So meaning, especially for a query letter, it can be important to do a lot of research up front to figure out if you're actually submitting or querying an agent that would even represent the work that you are that you're writing. In a conference situation or in any situation where you might meet agents, you're going to want to know who you're talking to. I think that I've been to conferences before where I could tell that writers just came up to me because I was standing there and I had the color tag that I was supposed to have on if I was an agent. But as soon as they started talking to me, it was really obvious that they hadn't read my bio, that they didn't know what it was that I actually represent. And the thing about that is, in a conference situation, not only are you wasting your time, your valuable time, but you're also then taking their time away from one of your fellow attendees who might actually be someone writing something that would be for them. So for connection, I think connection is almost off the page or off the scene. I don't know what the words I'm trying to, out of the room. You know what I mean, Lance, right?
I like
what
out
I
of the
mean
room.
is connection is something you're going to think about before you go up to somebody, but it's not necessarily going to be something that you feel you have to include in your conversation with them, if that makes sense. So that's connection. Right?
Yeah, I think the thing to keep in mind, too, for the conference next weekend is connection. You're already all connected because you're there. So you don't necessarily have to enter with a connection unless you saw that agent at a panel and you liked what they said, or you're familiar with one of their books. But otherwise, the connection's there, which leads us into context.
Although I will jump back and say I love that you mentioned seeing someone at a panel. I'm a big fan of if there's an agent that you're particularly interested in and you're at a conference, go to a panel that they are on, and even if it's not a subject that necessarily is, the most compelling subject for you in those 5 different panels that you could be picking from, but go listen to them. They will say something that will resonate with you ideally. And agents love to have their words thrown right back at them, followed by, I just thought it was so smart the way you talked about that. I can't get that out of my mind. So absolutely, that's a trick, guys. Go to the panels that the person you are into is on and let them say something that, and Michael Knoll points this out often to people, and I forget to do it, so I'm going to say it here for everybody in the room and anyone who's listening, that if you don't talk to someone in person at an event like the conference that's happening next weekend, you can still query them and reference that event. And you know what you do? You say something like, I saw you on a panel, you said this really brilliant thing, but you were so busy and every time I had a chance to go up to you, I could tell that you probably just needed, a break, or I never got the chance to chat with you, but I wanted to tell you about my book. And I think that's a really great way to make it clear I was there. I heard you, but actually I was kind of cool about it, and I didn't swamp you, and instead I'm just querying you now. And I think you can do that for every agent at an event like that if you've done your homework and they actually represent the things that you're working on.
Which leads us into context. So context is, where does your book sit on a bookshelf? Context is when you can talk to the agent, you can talk to the editor, and you can tell them what you've written. You may want to use a comparison. You may want to use certain keywords. We'll talk a little bit about some do keywords and some don't keywords, but it tells that agent, I am reading science fiction. I think that's an important thing to know going into it. If you are an agent who represents romances and someone has sent you a science fiction that has no romance in it, you want to know from the beginning what you're getting into. If you do not know what your context is, you're in one of the greatest bookstores in possibly the world, and they're open till 11. So if you think, I think I've written a mystery, but I'm not sure, browse those shelves. Browse those shelves tonight, look at the mystery books, read the description, see if that's where your book fits. For the purposes of an in-person pitch, I think basically context falls to either genre or category. So we're gonna do a little speed round now of various genres and categories of books to help spark your brains, starting with fiction. Go.
Westerns.
Science fiction.
Horror.
Fantasy.
Romance.
Erotica.
Young adult.
Military fiction.
Middle grade.
Amish fiction. It's a real thing.
Christian fiction.
Paranormal romance.
Cozy mysteries.
Speculative fiction.
Suspense.
Literary fiction.
Historical fiction.
So you get the point. So there's a huge wide swath of genres. Know what your book is. Nonfiction, you can do the same thing. Memoir.
Personal essay.
History.
Narrative nonfiction.
Self-help.
Cookbooks.
Coloring books.
Military history.
I feel like we need someone with a buzzer who can be when we repeat things. So you get the feeling. So there's a wide variety of categories and genres you can pick from, and be sure to pick the one that fits your book.
Easy, right? Okay. So when you understand your category. And part of the reason that we encourage you to do that is because it's a great way for you to sort of to anchor that person in your pitch. Meaning, before you start really talking about the book itself, saying a word like cozy mystery, memoir, historical fiction is a way for that agent to immediately know, okay, this is what I'm about to hear. And then you go into the rest of it. So I would absolutely encourage you in an in-person pitch to think about context first. And then I would also say that when you're writing a query letter, that context should come pretty early in the query letter, because it can be frustrating if you read a query letter and you think you're reading a query letter for a novel, and at the very bottom you find out it's a memoir or something like that. So I think that being really keeping the context short, but keeping the context at the top of the pitch.
And I think it's important, we're saying, where does your book sit on the bookshelf? Know what your comparison titles are, but also be really, really careful of extreme comparisons. You have not written the next Harry Potter. I hate to break it to you. So those are not the things you want to throw out. Also, and we'll talk about this a little bit more, literary fiction is a tricky, tricky description to use to talk about yourself. I think literary fiction, we'll talk about this when we get to credentials later on, is something that the agent should pull out themselves. You can say, I've just written a novel, and let them decide it as literary fiction. You're basically setting yourself up for failure when they go, I'll be the judge of that, and they start reading and they don't feel it's literary fiction. So,
well, also I think that both of those points bring back to a really important thing, is that you have only a short amount of time, right? And whether it's in a query letter, you have what I call valuable real estate, that one page, guys, just in case you're not sure, one page. And then in a pitch, you have either 10 minutes, again, the longest 10 minutes of your life, but still 10 minutes, or you have a moment after a panel when you might be able to talk to somebody if they're not running off somewhere. So the less you distract them. So I hope someone in here is writing the next Harry Potter, because I believe in all of you in a way that I guess Lance doesn't.
sorry.
But the minute you say Harry Potter, their mind goes somewhere else. And instead, you want to keep them on you. You want to keep them focused on you. So if you throw out those really lofty comparisons, either, own it, have a really good reason for saying it, or skip it altogether.
Which leads us to compel. And I don't know, you can see there are 3 different boards up here. You'll see that compel is the biggest square on those boards. Compel, that's the meat. Compel is that short, in this case longer than the rest of it, but still short, pithy description of your book. It is that teaser that makes someone want to read more of what you have to say. Compel is my favorite part of all of my pitches. When I'm sitting down at a book fair to talk about books with foreign publishers, connection, I don't have to talk about it. We're all there. Context, oh, you've published this, I have something similar, and then I can launch into my compel, which is my description. So we have now taken compel, and we've broken it down into kind of pieces, so you can make it a little bit easier to figure out what goes in your compel description.
Yeah, so we're going to talk about elements of story. And for us, when we were thinking about the ways to talk about this very important paragraph that is also so hard to tell someone how to write, we thought those 4 elements: who, where, when, and what. So who being character, right? So who is the character? Even if you have 6, 7, 2, 3, whatever number of characters you may have in your book, and all of them I know are essential and important, but maybe thinking of a way to focus on 1 or 2 of them, the ones that are just simply going to circle you back to that goal, which is to have somebody ask to read something. So and this goes back to cast of character, it's not a list of characters, it's who in your book is going to emotionally connect with that reader, because that's what I respond to. As an agent, I primarily would really focus in on who is my main character, and do I feel a connection with them based on, a variety of characteristics that either that query letter or the opening of that manuscript gave me.
And then where? I think I'm like Becca. I respond really, really strongly to character. I want to know who this book is about. I want to know if it's nonfiction, who's leading me through the story. If it's fiction, who's it about? And where can also be a character. Where could be New York City? Where could be a haunted house? Where could be a lifeboat in the middle of the ocean? If where is relevant and authentic to your story, it's important to include. I grew up in Montana, on a small town outside of Billings, Montana. If you came and pitched me and said I've written a book in Billings, Montana, I would probably get up and walk out because it's not interesting. So you want to find that thing that is interesting and fascinating.
But if you said, I'm writing a book set in Billings, Montana, the day after a meteor hits and destroys the rest of the United States, except this town in Billings, Montana.
Now I'm in.
Now you're in, right?
And what have you done with that?
I have made it more compelling.
How?
By adding I think the what, right?
I think you added the when.
The when? The when!
It's after the meteor
Okay,
hit.
so where and when go hand in hand. And when is it a historical period, a historical time period? Is it the future? Does it happen over the course of a week? And what is it about that week that is so important? Does it happen the day before a wedding? Does it happen 6 months after the zombie apocalypse? So if there's something about the when in your story, and guys, for fiction and nonfiction, we hope you can see that these 4 C's are applicable. So for memoir, certainly, and we'll get into a little bit more about nonfiction, but so that's the when. What is the when of your story?
And then the what is what happens. She falls in love with the wrong man. He is a Major League Baseball player who gets called up to play, a minor league baseball player who gets called up to play in the World Series. I hiked the Appalachian Trail. That's the what. That is what happens. I think the important thing to keep in mind, we've listed 4 W's within compel. You need not include all 4. I think if you include all 4, it gets a little jumbled. You pick the 2 or 3 that are the best. And an excellent, excellent exercise to get into the heart of your book and what it means is to write a full 1-page description of your book. Write a full 1-page description, follow these rules if you want, but really, really focus on the compel. The compel could be an entire page. And then take a look at it, see where are the W's, which W's matter, which W's are relevant, which W's are authentic to this story. And then it's gonna get hard. It's gonna get hard, but you're gonna have to do it. You have to go through that description, sentence by sentence, word by word, and figure out what matters. You need to go through and Marie Kondo, Coco Chanel that description, toss out what doesn't matter, and when you've done that enough times and you've gone over it enough times, you will be down to somewhere between like 5 sentences, maybe 4, maybe 7, depending, and those will be your compel. That is the most important relevant thing that will draw people in.
And we know it all matters, but what matters in this moment? So what's really relevant when you're talking to a literary agent? What's compelling to someone who's in the industry, who has pitched so many books so often? What is the most relevant and compelling thing in that moment?
And there may be things that you think are relevant and compelling that are. It may be that your lead character is a vampire. You need to say that. But it also may be, and I think I've talked about this before, I worked on a literary novel where the chorus of the book is mosquitoes. It is a swarm of mosquitoes. I do not talk about that in my pitch because it's not relevant to the story. It just happens to be an icing on the cake, if you would, and I don't want to turn someone off. So it's the relevant, important pieces.
I'm so glad you said that because I think there can sometimes be a fine line between compelling and just weird. And so sometimes the weird in the in-person pitch doesn't work so well. Sometimes the weird in the query letter doesn't work so well. You know where the weird can come in? When you start to have that good conversation with that person, there's a back and forth, you're kind of like gelling, and then you say, oh, and the chorus is a swarm of mosquitoes. And they're like, I'm in, I'm already in. Or it could be the thing that you shouldn't say because then they might change their mind about reading it. So just think about that. Don't try to drop something super surprising on them, but it's more what is the most interesting thing. Yeah. So credentials are the 4th C. We would say that credentials are also not a huge part of an in-person pitch for sure. Credentials are one of the most important pieces of nonfiction pitches, meaning if you're writing a nonfiction book that is not a memoir, because a memoir is about you, your credentials are that it happened to you. But if you're writing a nonfiction book that is subject-based, then it is very important for you to say whether it's your academic credentials, whether it's your own professional credentials, why it is that you're the person to write that book. And I think credentials will come up in a nonfiction pitch in person, but they are absolutely important in a query letter for nonfiction. So if you're writing fiction, we actually think that you don't need to worry about credentials, especially in the in-person pitch. But if you have some elements to your credentials that are relevant, don't force it. But if you have been to an MFA program, if you have been published in journals, magazines, your fiction has been published, and even, I'd say if you've been publishing personal essays, something a little more narrative, nonfiction. But if you're writing for science magazines, hardcore, crazy science, and you are writing a romance, then that's not relevant to your credentials. So your credentials, MFA program, publishing experience, contest winners, contest finalists, awards, that sort of thing.
So we've broken it down. We've told you what a pitch isn't. We've given you 4 C's. We've given you 4 little W's within the C of compel. Now we're going to put it all together. So what we've done is Becca and I have taken and created pitches for 4 published books hidden behind these beautiful doors. It's like The Price is Right or something. So we're going to now reveal one of these, and then we're all going to work together as a team to reveal the other ones in a little bit. So Becca, you want to go to the board and reveal?
Yes, but before I do that, I just want to one last time say, for an in-person pitch, context compel. That's what we really want you to think about tonight. For a query letter, we would encourage you to think about all 4 of those C's. Okay, the connection for this first book is you represented Rebecca Mackay's The Great Believers.
All right.
The context is, similarly, my novel is set against the backdrop of the AIDS epidemic and the rise of reality TV culture.
All right.
Tell me
we know
more.
where that goes on the bookshelf. All right. What's
Okay.
next? Compel. So as you can see, compel is longer.
Sell is the skeptical publicist for America's most watched shock talk show. Semi is the closeted host's former lover. Through the eyes of these 2 strangers, we travel from 1970s Greenwich Village to the glass and steel towers of a greed is good New York, where reality TV is king and selling your soul for ratings is the commerce of the day.
And are there credentials? It's a novel. Are there credentials?
I attended the Iowa Writers Workshop and was a Stanford University Stegner Fellow.
All right. So you see, this takes all those pieces we talked about. There's the 4 C's. There's W's. It's something that you could imagine saying to someone at a party. It's conversational. It's very simple. It's laid out. Becca, do you want to say other things about this? I think some people know what this book is.
I hope they do, because it's wonderful. Yeah, I think that, positive things about it? Yeah. So what I really like is the who. So we have 2 characters. I can tell you there are many characters in this novel, but we've focused on 2 main characters. And we've talked about the fact that they're strangers, but they're going to reveal this setting, if you will, and that's the other thing we talked about is the where. So you know where it's going to take place, and you know who these characters are and a little bit about them. The word skeptical, I think, is a great word. Closeted host, former lover, intrigue, and then you know it's going to take place in New York.
And you can see, too, how the where and when are melded. All right, so each of these slips of paper holds 1 C for a specific book. So look at your piece of paper. Look at these 4 C's we've just talked about. Try to figure out which C you have. And the first thing we're going to ask for is who has what they believe is a connection.
And believe me, there's multiples in the room. So some of you are going to hear someone read what you have.
I read in a recent interview where you said you want to represent important books.
Very
That is a
good.
connection.
I read in a recent interview where you want to represent important books.
That's not it. Hold on.
Number 4. So Becca will now reveal the connection. So now, who believes they have the
Another-
context that goes along with that connection? Building off of that connection, who has a context that they feel fits?
So the connection again is, I read a recent interview where you said you want to represent important books.
Important books. We have one in the back.
You know you guys are going to have to talk at the conference, right? Let's just do some practicing.
I think the context is my YA novel is a reflection on race and police brutality set in today's political climate.
Do we feel like that fits? My YA novel is a reflection of race and police brutality in today's political climate. I think that fits. Important book, I think that fits.
Let's find out.
I think you're probably starting to figure out what this book is. Who has the compel? 16-year-old Star Carter moves between two worlds, the poor black neighborhood where she lives and the primarily white, fancy suburban prep school she attends. The uneasy balance between these two worlds is shattered when Star witnesses the fatal shooting of her childhood best friend Khalil at the hands of a police officer. Khalil was unarmed. As the only witness to the shooting, Star must choose how she wants to survive in her two worlds, by being the person her friends, family, and community expect her to be, or by being the person she truly wants to be. Becca, would you like to reveal? All right, so I think that's pretty compelling, and that's a pretty, that draws you in. What happens? I want to know what's going on. And this is a tricky credentials. Does anyone have the credentials that goes along with this? Yes. Oh. This is my first novel. Those are the credentials. Well done. So we've now built together an entire pitch for The Hate You Give. All right, great. So moving on. And then we're going to go back and talk about all four of these at the end. Who has the next connection? Who has a new connection?
I know you represent both nature writers and memoirists.
Does that sound like a connection? Is that something you'd say to someone? Yeah. All right, great. Who has the context?
My memoir is the personal experience I had meeting and studying octopus and what I learned about them and myself in the process.
My personal experience meeting and studying octopus.
Which is the plural.
It is, if you've read this book, you will know that the plural of octopus is octopus. All right, who has our octopus compel?
I spent the last 5 years traveling the world, spending time with octopus and talking to marine biologists about how these mysterious, intelligent creatures think, feel, and interact with humans. I spent time with 2 different Pacific octopus in the New England Aquarium in Boston and learned to scuba dive so I could swim with octopus in their natural environment. What I discovered was an amazing creature that we don't know much about.
Very good, yeah. Octopus. And who has the credentials? It sounds to me, if you're someone who spent a lot of time studying octopus, you're with marine biologists, you should probably have some credentials to back this up.
I am a naturalist and documentary screenwriter. I've received numerous awards, including Lifetime Achievement Awards from Humane Society.
Mm-hmm. So there we are. So who knows what this book is? It's a book called The Soul of an Octopus by Cy Montgomery. And this is what she does. So we'll unpack that in a little bit. All right, we've got one more. One more to go. Who has the connection? Who has a connection that's not been read?
Trick question. There is no
There
connection.
is no connection for this one. So if you're at the conference and you have a one-on-one meeting, you wouldn't need a connection. Your connection is, I'm sitting down with you, I'm on your schedule. All right. So who has a context that has not yet been read?
Set in an alternate reality, women all over the world start to awaken electrical powers in themselves, allowing them to send a jolt through anything or anyone they touch. As women begin to rise to power, men suddenly find themselves in a position of weakness. Several women, a political candidate and mother, a mobster's daughter, and an Eastern European dictator's wife, start to use this power to change the world and their own standing in it.
All right. Now, quick poll. Do we think that's a context or do we think that's a compel? A compel. We think that. And what is it missing for the context? Where does it sit on the shelf?
Imagine a world where humans can generate their own electricity and release it through their hands. What if that power was only held by women?
You see, we did both. We did imagine a world, and we ended on a question.
And then in the query letter, of course, you'd put a question mark and an exclamation point.
Because it's super important. All right, and we have the compel. All right. Who's got our final credentials? Right behind you, Michael.
I'm the co-writer of an audio app series and also contribute to a science radio program.
Exactly. So
that was.
So who knows what that book is? The Power by Naomi Alderman. All right. So we've unpacked 4 different pitches. Some are good, some are not so good. And so now we're going to talk a little bit about what makes each of them what we think good. And we'd love to have your feedback too if you're like, but what about this? You said this earlier. So let's start over here with, we didn't talk about what this book is. The Spectators.
The Spectators by Jennifer. Does anyone know? Has anyone read this book? It's wonderful.
You should read it.
Okay. She's a local author, guys. Support your local authors.
Mm-hmm. All right. So we talked a little bit about the connection on this and how using a direct comparison that way to a book that's very similar might work, might not work, might backfire. I like the similarly my novel. One could call this book literary fiction. We don't talk about that. It's in the credentials. I attended Iowa Writers Workshop and Stanford University Stegner Fellow. So she's saying, I have the chops. I have experience. I've written books. She's written other books before. We're not talking about that. Because for the purpose of this, these are all debut novels. Debut nonfiction, debut novels. It's a first book. So this is her first book. Let's break down the compel paragraph.
So again, with the compel, I think that having 2 characters that we're focusing on, having the strong setting and the strong when, I think one could say that there could be a little bit more about what exactly happens in this book. We sort of rested on our pretty sentence laurels and we were very proud of the greed is good, New York. But it doesn't, I think if I were to suggest anything for this pitch, I would say that absolutely after you said that paragraph, I think someone would be potentially interested. I think it's a compelling enough start, but I think you better be ready for them to say, so what happens? And then you're going to need to dive into a lot more information about who, and I would probably focus on one of these characters to do that sell or semi.
So I think we can agree that one's pretty good. It's a pretty good one. Let's go to the terrible one. Let's go to The Power by Naomi Alderman. What's wrong with context? Everything. So is there another version? You came up with another version today of what you could use as context instead.
Oh, I did. I said my novel takes The Handmaid's Tale and flips it on its head. Because instead of it being a really frightening place for women to live, as The Handmaid's Tale is, this book is the opposite of that. And now suddenly women have a tremendous amount of power, and fellas are a little bit nervous.
Yeah, and I think it's good too because it establishes you're writing kind of that speculative fiction without saying...
Because that's really what's missing from that context is where does this book sit on the bookstore shelf, right? Where does this book sit on the bookstore shelf? That's what you need up there, and that's what I think mentioning The Handmaid's Tale gets you, or you could even say a novel with, speculative fiction.
Speculative fiction, I think, is good. All right, the compel for this. Set in an alternate reality, women all over the world start to awaken electrical powers in themselves, allowing them to send a jolt through everything and anyone they touch. That's pretty good. I think it's a pretty good sentence.
Uh-huh.
What's next, though?
As women begin to rise to power, men suddenly find themselves in a position of weakness. Several women, a political candidate, a mother, a mobster's daughter, and an Eastern European dictator's wife, start to use this power to change the world and their own standing in it.
So I think the issue we get into there, it starts to turn into a list of characters. And this book, if you've read it, is alternating chapters of all the different women and the power that awakens in them. But I don't want to list them all. I think you could focus on one, maybe 2 of the women and talk even a little bit more about them. You know, the political candidate and mother, and her daughter starts to develop the electrical powers too. How does she handle that? How do we live in this world? So I think that's a problematic sentence that could use a little fine-tuning.
Yeah, I think the who is what's really just what you said. The who is what is not coming out. And I would actually move the who to the top and have maybe even, you know, when you say flip The Handmaid's Tale on its head, because my novel sees women, you know, suddenly waking up one day with the power to shoot electricity through their touch. Then you get into here, and and I would focus first on the who and name check a few characters.
So I think if you walked into a meeting and this was your pitch, be proud. It's still a decent pitch. It can use some fine tuning and some tweaking.
And that's our goal here tonight, is to give you some examples and hopefully help you guys think about the ways that your pitch could be fine-tuned or tweaked.
All right.
What do you think of the credentials there?
Do we think the credentials are relevant? She is a co-writer on an audio app series and also contributes to a science radio program. I think you could go either way. I think the one thing that I like about these credentials is this thought that she's a contributor to a science radio program leads me to believe that at least the science in this book will have some merit to it. I don't know that it's completely necessary.
The science where the women can shoot electricity
Yeah.
out of their hands. I would actually say that in an in-person pitch, this is not, you're never going there unless you're at the point where they're like, so what's your day job? But in a query letter, I think that my first thought with my agent hat on is, why aren't you naming that audio app? How many people listen to that audio app? How many people? So if your credentials have a built-in audience that are going to be guaranteed to be interested in what you've done, then that's great, but I think that's that's not necessary.
I also think in a one-on-one, this is something you can keep in your pocket. This is something when that agent or editor starts asking you questions, oh, did you do any research? Well, actually, I also write for this app, or I do research for this science program I'm on. So it's something to kind of keep. It's not something you need to necessarily lead with, unlike Cy Montgomery. So Cy Montgomery is a naturalist. She is an environmentalist. She's a researcher. Those are all important credentials. I would almost bump those up to the top, up to your context. In my job as a naturalist, I have done the following.
Yeah, I think I love the connection here. I love it because this book especially, and this can happen with memoir, you guys know, if you're writing memoir or if you read memoir, the memoir space is huge. The shelf is giant. There's every kind of person out there writing about their own stories. So to find an agent, how lucky to find an agent who actually, and that's a great, brilliant idea. Oh, I should look for an agent who's also does nature writers or is interested in the natural world because that's what my memoir does. Pointing that out, connection is great. My memoir is the personal experience I had meeting and studying octopus. Of course, everyone's first thought is going to be, oh, they don't even know that plural for octopus is octopi. And what I learned about them and myself in the process, I also really like. My problem with this one is the compel, because I think that the compel is heavy on octopus, but light on memoir. So when you tell me that you learned things about yourself in the process, then I kind of need to have a little bit of your journey in here too. So that's something to think about, especially for the folks who are writing memoir in the room or other nonfiction, that you want to make sure that you are sort of offering in the compel whatever it is you're promising at the opening of the query.
And I can say this is a real story. This is a little misleading because it doesn't talk about the memoir, because I have a friend who read this book. I am a huge, huge fan of this book. I love octopus. I think it's fascinating. She didn't like it because there was too much memoir in the book and she wanted more octopus. So if this is your compel and all you're talking about is octopus and then you start reading it and there's all this memoir stuff, you're turning off. So what you've done in that case is you have left out very, very relevant pieces of this compel, which is it's my story and the things that I was going through as well.
Yeah, and I think that is a great point, that you want to make sure that if there's a really big piece to your story, that it's not missing from that compel part. So then I'm a naturalist and documentary screenwriter. I've received numerous awards, including Lifetime Achievement Awards from the Humane Society. I mean, you kind of have to ask to read pages just for that reason alone. They got awards from the Humane Society.
I mean, that's impressive.
Yeah, so I think the credentials are totally fine.
All right, should we move on to the hate you give?
We should.
How do we feel about this connection?
I read a recent interview where you said you want to represent important books.
Yeah, it's
well, that's
not
bold.
Good.
Don't we all want to represent important books? So that was kind of a, I hope you guys recognize that that's not something that you would say in a pitch or in a query letter, that, you know, you can absolutely, what I love about the contact or the connection is referencing an interview. That is a great thing you can do. You can go out there in the world, find interviews on blogs and other places. Again, repeat those words back to them. They love, love, love it. But I think really boldly stating in the very first line that you have written an important book, and it's the kind of important book they want to represent, might be a turnoff for some people. It might not be for others, but why distract them? Again, going back to that idea of distraction.
I think actually the rest of this one is very, very good. I think the context, my YA novel, here's what it's about. The compel is extremely compelling. It makes you want to read it. Credentials, this is my first novel, not really necessary. I don't think you need to include that, particularly in a one-on-one pitch, but I think maybe in a query letter you could say, this is my first novel, but you as an agent, what's your response to that?
Yeah, I don't mind it, but I think that the idea here too was that, you know, we wanted to represent all different writers at different stages and with different backgrounds. And the thing is, the compelling thing here, you know, if you look at Jennifer Dubois' description, one of the most compelling things on there for an agent may very well be that they attended the Iowa Writers Workshop, because that agent is immediately making an assumption, and they may not even be that super into that description, but they decide to ask for pages, right? And that kind of sucks for the 98.9% of us who didn't go to the Iowa Writers Workshop, myself included. The point is, if your credential is this is your first novel and you've just written an awesome book, that's fine too. But the compel is going to be, what's going to compel them is absolutely going to be the description, and then probably the context as well. And I actually think this context serves this purpose. You know they want to represent important books, and you're telling them you've written a book that is a reflection on race and police brutality in today's world. I think they can figure out that this could be something that fits into their wheelhouse.
And I think to go back to the compel one more time, because I do think this is the best compel of the four up here. If you look at that compel and you think about the W's, there's only two. It's only who and what happened. There's no talk about where. There's no talk about when. It's not relevant. What's relevant is Star and her best friend being shot and how she reacts to it. Great. All right, we're going to jump into some quick do's and don'ts, and then we'll open it up for questions. So, some do's. Here's a very, very exciting do for next weekend at the conference. If someone asks you to send them pages, ask how they would like to receive them. Before you leave that table, how can I send you material? What is your email address? Ask those questions. If you forget, ask that agent later. If you see them in a cocktail bar at the reception, feel free to walk and be like, sorry, you said I could send you pages and I forgot to write down your email address. Can I get it quickly?
Don't expect agents and editors to take anything away with them, either from a one-on-one meeting or a chance encounter. If you have written a graphic novel, a picture book, or illustrated book, we do think it's a good idea to bring a sample to show, but don't expect anyone to take anything away with them, and they may not even be interested in looking at the samples. So,
though, bring business cards. Bring business cards, not necessarily for the editors and agents, but for all the awesome people you're going to meet next weekend. You're going to make a ton of connections with your fellow writers. You're going to have an instant bonding with them. Get a business card from them, and then a little tip from this one is that write a little note on the back of that business card of who that person was, what your connection was, why you liked them so much, that when you get home and 3 weeks later you go through your business cards, you're like, oh, right, they were super duper fun. If you don't have business cards, they're super easy to make. You can just make them online and pick them up or have them sent to you.
Do know when to walk away. So if you get a yes, if somebody says, I want you to send me pages, then that is the time that you ask, how can I do that? What's your email address? And then if you're in a one-on-one consultation, you can use that extra time to ask them some questions about the industry, to ask them questions about, I think it's always interesting to ask, of your clients who are writing in this genre, what are some of the things they're doing to distinguish themselves? Maybe get them talking about what they know authors have done that have sort of set them apart. But especially if you catch someone after a panel, if you're talking to them in another place besides that consultation, I would just really encourage you to cut to the chase. If they say yes, get the email address, and walk away, partly because you want to be respectful of the other people who are also hoping to have some time with that person, partly because maybe they just want to go grab a glass of water, and so it's time for them to get a little bit of a break, but even more so because you may say something if you keep like prattling on, as I like to call it, that could make them change their minds. That might be when you bring up those mosquitoes and they're like, that is not gonna fly.
If you have a one-on-one consultation, do not seek out that agent prior to your meeting. Don't feel you need to go introduce yourself and say how excited you are to see them on Saturday for 10 minutes, because you're already like jumping ahead. You're jumping the gun. Just wait to meet them at the one-on-one.
Well, and again, you're taking up some valuable time, right? You've got your 10 minutes. Let's let them do what they need to do in that moment with maybe other writers wanting to talk to them. And it can be awkward. As an agent who has had people do that, it's like, oh, cool. So I guess we shouldn't talk now. So I wouldn't do it. Don't argue. You are not going to change their minds. And this is true. I mean, if somebody says to you, actually, I don't agree with the premise of this nonfiction book you're writing, it's not going to be for me. This is not the time to get into a back and forth and convince them that they are not seeing your issue the way that they should see it. I would just, recognize that if you can't change someone's mind, it's time to just move on. So starting an argument with someone or really becoming kind of forceful with your opinions is not going to endear you to anyone. And then you know what? They may very well say to their other agent friends, like, wow, steer clear of that one. They really did start to, make me uncomfortable because they wouldn't listen to what I was saying.
Don't offer to buy agents and editors drinks. They will get drink tickets, and they'll have big, fancy corporate expense accounts. They are fine. However, there are 4 people, 3 of whom are in this room right now, who work for the Writers League of Texas, who work very, very hard, and you can buy them a drink if you want.
They don't get any drink tickets. And in all seriousness, that is awkward. It is awkward when someone comes up to you as an agent and says, hey, can I buy you a drink? And it's very friendly and very nice, but it just feels like we're about to have a transaction where I'm supposed to offer something in return, and I'm not prepared to do that. Don't pitch more than one project. So I do think that when you go into an event, in a query letter too, when you go into an event, when you're writing a query letter, you really want to commit to one project and focus on that project. And you may have other things that you're interested in. You may have other books that you're working on. And you may even have 2 projects that you're bringing into a situation like the conference, but maybe one agent is right for one of them, one agent's right for the other. Sure, you might then have 2 different sit-downs and talk about those different books, but in terms of, that valuable time you have, that valuable real estate, don't muddy the waters by talking about more than one project.
And kind of bouncing off of that, use your space and your time wisely. If you have a one-on-one session, use the full 10 minutes. But if you're talking to an agent or an editor at one of the receptions, say what you want to say and move on. Don't linger. There's a line of people behind you waiting them to see. On a query letter, you have 1 page. That is valuable real estate. Again, like I said earlier, with writing them 1 page and cutting it down, make sure every word counts.
And I think it's a great idea to ask the other people who've read your work, your friends, your folks who are in your writing group, maybe your critique circle. Say to them, hey, what's the most compelling thing about this book to you? Because they may surprise you with what their answer is, and that could be a really great way for you to start to zero in on what you're going to say to people in a pitch or in a query letter. Do think about word choices. First debut novel, fiction novel, fiction memoir. Lance said erotic YA.
I did not say erotic YA.
So just, if you're not sure about the words you're using, and I think this is very true for any number of genres and categories, occasionally we might say something like I often hear, and I've been known to use this phrase myself, upmarket women's fiction. And I know exactly what I believe that phrase means, but I also think it's a phrase that people in publishing use more than writers would actually use to describe their own work. And I think that's very true of literary fiction as well. So if you're saying something and you're not really clear on what that means, just stick with the simple, this is my novel, this is my mystery, and don't force it beyond that.
Don't bring distracting props, and that includes the jacket for your book that you designed yourself. And if you've written a book, the greatest book ever about a puppy, and he doesn't talk, so Becca loves it, don't bring the stuffed animal that was the inspiration. Just don't bring anything with you that could distract. These 10 minutes are for you and the agent or editor to have a conversation.
Don't bring cookies either.
Unless you give them to the Writers League of Texas
If you
staff.
leave them at our table, we will take care of them for you. Do ask questions and take notes for sure, guys. Bring a notebook. We'll have a space in the program for you to take notes if you're coming to our conference, but anywhere you are talking to agents, take notes. Don't expect and don't ask to record the session, because that is just going to make them uncomfortable and it's going to put them on the spot, and it's not something that we do at our conference, at least.
Do bring notes with you. As you can see, we've been working from notes all night tonight. It's okay to be nervous. It's okay to read your pitch if you really, really need to. However,
don't expect the agent or editor to read your pitch. So in all seriousness, there's a big difference between you sitting across from someone and saying, and I'm a big fan of saying this if it's true, I'm really nervous. I've been, working really hard to memorize my pitch, but I really think I might need to use my notes. I hope you don't mind. I'm gonna probably read part of this to you. And they will absolutely say, that's fine. It's all good. But that's completely different from setting down a piece of paper and saying, could you read this? And I will sit here silently and watch you while you read this. That's awkward. And so, guys, truly, they know you're nervous. They expect that you're nervous. They want to put you at ease, but just own it. I think there's something really, that. You've been out in the world and someone has said, wow, I'm just really nervous right now. And it's very endearing, and it can be a great way to connect with someone. So don't worry about it.
Don't say your book will appeal to everyone, because it's not going to. I think we all have different opinions. We all feel differently about things. You're setting yourself up for just massive failure by saying everyone's going to love this book.
But it also sounds like, to me, when you say that you didn't do your homework and you're not really sure what the market for your book is. And so, do be polite, but don't feel that you have to waste time on small talk. So if you have 10 precious minutes, you don't have to start it by saying, so how are you liking Austin? Have you seen the bats? Anything like that, and especially if you're in passing at a reception and you want to say, I think small talk there, cool small talk could be, I saw you on a panel earlier today and I just thought it was really cool what you said about historical fiction being the lifeblood of American literature. I loved it. Don't waste time on small talk.
And kind of spinning out that, listen to what they have to say. Do listen to what these agents and editors are saying, either on the panels or when you sit down to talk with them. Also, listen to what your fellow attendees have to say. If you pitch to someone who's also a writer at one of the receptions or doing one of the genre sessions, and they give you feedback, listen to that. Take it in.
Be open-minded and leave your preconceived notions at the door. I think this can also often be true, too, of, many things, of course, but I think sometimes we go into a conference like this and we think, okay, agents are the enemy. They're really scary, but I have to have one, so I guess I'll put up with it. They don't really do anything, but you give them 15%. Or, traditional publishing is dead, long live ebooks, those sorts of things that you might walk into the door already thinking. And our goal from putting, and Michael, who has done a tremendous amount of work to put this conference together, his goal is to really let you learn everything you can about today in publishing, and then also what agents do. So leave some of those. You might sit down across from an agent who's 25 years old, and you may not be 25 years old, and you might think, well, what can this child do for me? And I'll tell you, a lot. So any sort of preconceived notions you might have or ideas about any number of things, leave them behind.
Be aware of body language. You'll be able to pick up a lot of cues from sitting down with someone or talking to your fellow attendees and pitching something, and you can see when that light goes out in their eyes and they're not listening anymore. Or if you're at one of the receptions, you're talking to an agent and they're constantly looking around and they're looking at the line neck behind them and their drink is empty, it's a good time to excuse yourself.
Do check your ego at the door. So you are going to be rejected, whether it's through a query letter you sent out or whether it is in person at an event like a conference. It is going to happen. You know what? As an agent, I got rejected all the time. I would submit a book out to 15 editors, and 13 of them would say no. So it only takes one, but rejection sucks, but also it's not personal. So please just keep that in mind. If you sit down across from someone and you know on their bio that they represent the sort of book that you're writing, but we all know that the word memoir in a bio doesn't necessarily mean they're going to be interested in exactly your memoir. Don't take it personally if they say it's not for them. Use the time and get as much information as you can.
If you have a one-on-one consultation, don't talk for 10 minutes straight. Sit down, give your pitch, and then allow feedback. Have a conversation, have a dialogue with that agent.
Breathe. Do breathe. Relax. Agents and editors are also human. They may be a little nervous. Some of them this might be their first or second or third conference, or they just don't love being in a room with a bunch of other people. Some of them are writers too. And just relax and remember that it's a short conversation and you're going to get through it.
Do have fun. I think that's the most important thing to keep in mind. You're at this conference where writing is such a solitary endeavor, and to spend the weekend with friends and colleagues who are doing the same thing you're doing and to be able to just talk about books, which we all love, is a fantastic opportunity. So you may be nervous, you may be unsure, just breathe and have fun.
And do find a staff member throughout the weekend if you need a pep talk, if you want to share good news with us. That's one of my favorite things about the conference is folks will stop by and say, someone asked for some pages. Or I just met the coolest writer and I think we're going to start a writing group. Come find us. We will give you a pep talk. We will hear your good news. We'll say a friendly hello. So for sure, remember that we're there for you and that you will be in good hands. Sometimes folks wonder, should I go to a conference and talk about my manuscript if my manuscript's not done, if I'm not ready to turn around and send it? And absolutely, if you're here and you really want to be there that weekend and get to know, because there's so much you're going to get out of a conference beyond pitching and having someone ask for material. But sure, there's no problem if it's not done. I would just be upfront when someone asks you, is it done? And you would say, it's not yet. I'm just putting the finishing touches on it. I want it to be in the best shape possible when I send it out. And they will say that's absolutely fine, because I can guarantee you they're not going to go home and sit at their desk and wait for your query letter or your email. But know this, and some folks don't do this, if someone says they want you to submit to them after the conference, please, please, please still write a query letter, because the query letter is a tool that is valuable for them as much as it's valuable for you. And oftentimes agents use a query letter to start thinking about the way they will talk about a book, and then sometimes a query letter makes its way into the submission letter that they actually send to editors. So don't just send 20 pages and a note that says, you asked for it, here it is. So no, it doesn't need to be finished in order to pitch. And then I want to come back up here and say that the different avenues for agents, absolutely, you can do, obviously do events like a conference. You can look on the bookstore shelf at books that are in your category and see who represented those books, because those are agents that are representing books in those categories. These days, and we have, I know, at least one panel at the conference about people who get agents through doing Twitter contests and other sort of new social media ways of finding agents. And then it's just really doing a lot of research and a lot of good, old-fashioned work, right? So we're going to open it up to questions, I think.
Which were the two? Say again, which were the two things you said were most important for the in-person thing?
Yeah, so for the in-person, we want you to focus on context and compel. So where does your book sit on the bookstore shelf? And what's the most interesting thing about your book? What's that descriptive paragraph? And you can kind of leave connection and credentials out.
You talked about don't argue. Like if you're approaching an agent and it's not going to work for them, would it be inappropriate to ask, do you have a recommendation? Or is there someone off the top of your head that you think I would be a good fit for?
I think the best way to, so the question was, you don't argue. And when I say argue, I don't even mean about, like, if they say no, yeah, hopefully you're not going to be like, I'm really mad at you now. I mean more like in more a substantive conversation about what's in the book. But yes, absolutely. If someone says to you, it's not for me, if they work at a bigger literary agency, so if Mariah Spence from Janklow and Nesbitt says to you, I don't think this is for me, I think it's absolutely appropriate to say to her, do you know, is there anyone else at Janklow and Nesbitt that you would suggest I send this to? I wouldn't assume that they're going to do the work of recommending other agents outside of their own agency to you, but I think you can ask that question for inside the agency.
I wanted to see if you would give some examples of clear, compelling subject lines for emails.
For the subject line of an email, I am just a fan of query letter, all caps, and then, or query, all caps, and then the title of your book and your name. The reason I'm a fan of that is because then they have to open that email, and it gives you the opportunity for them to actually start reading your query letter. And I don't think anyone, unless they, when you're submitting and doing query letters, you're going to read the submission guidelines for every agency that you're going to submit to. And if they say, this is what I want your subject line to look like, that's what your subject line will look like. But if they don't tell you that, I would just keep it very short and sweet. Query, The Lord of the Rings, not even your first, just Tolkien. And then in the letter itself, start diving into context.
My question is, I'm going to be very, very well articulated, but what I mean to say is, from the other side of the equation, as the agent looks at you and they hear what you have to say, what is it about how you say what you say, or other things about you that they want to know?
Such a good question and really hard to answer because I think they probably go into, as you would expect, any situation with their own sort of ideas, preconceived notions, and all of those other things that we encourage them before the start of the event to also set aside and to really just hear, what is that book, what is it about, and is it something that would interest them? So I would say for folks who sat across from me, it was less about what I needed to know about them. Here's the best advice someone gave me when I was becoming an agent was, don't take on a client that you don't want to talk to every day. Because you may not talk to them every day, but you may. So you as an agent, I think, start to get really good at spotting warning signs that for you, and which may be different for other agents, but that for you might be something that would turn you off long-term in a client. So if I'm sitting and talking to someone and they're constantly interrupting me, or they're trying to finish my sentence for me before I get a chance to get it out, or they're telling me why what I'm saying isn't what they mean, that can be a sign. So I think that's what they're really doing. Honestly, they're listening to the content, and then they're trying to understand a little bit more about what it would be like if they were to talk to you every day. And that's kind of the cool thing about in-person consultations and conferences is you get to do the same thing. There could be an agent, perfectly great agent on paper, and when you sit across from them, you realize, wow, this guy's got the biggest ego, and I'm not sure that I would be able to deal with that, or whatever. So I think that it's an opportunity for you to do the same thing, but nothing other than that, unless their credentials really are important to what it is they're writing.
I would also add, just as we said earlier, be open. Be willing to listen to what they have to say, because part of that relationship with that agent in the long term is going to be them throwing ideas and suggestions to you that you may not agree with, and you being able to try it and willing to try it. And so just being open to whatever feedback you get from them is really, really important.
Hi. What are some of the differences between pitching an agent and pitching an editor?
Oh, that's a great question. So the reality is that most editors are not going to see material. Editors from major publishing houses are not going to consider material that doesn't come through an agent. But the other thing about editors is they tend to be more niche. So an agent might represent a huge spectrum of things, right? Everything from memoir to YA to any number of other things. An editor tends to be a little bit more focused. And so if you're sitting down across from an editor who's working on thrillers or working on romance or whatever it might be, I think that's a great opportunity to learn a little bit more about the business and learn a little bit more about the market today and ask them questions like, what on your big list sets an author apart? So it's almost like you can pitch them, you can talk to them about your work. They may be able to give you some interesting feedback just based on what you say. about your own project, but I think also they could very well just have a cool conversation with you about the industry. Also, keep in mind, editors know all of the agents. So you may even, if you're having a great conversation with an editor, you could absolutely say, is there an agent that you think, you know, is really interested in this sort of book today? And they may give you a couple of names.
Can you quickly comment on making choices about your font, your, you know, how you format your table of contents, pages, or is that?
Yeah, I mean, I would say that when in doubt, Times New Roman 12 is your friend. And margins, like 1-inch margins, just basic. Oftentimes the agencies, if you're submitting, are gonna have guidelines for you, so they may even tell you, but if they don't tell you what font, that's the way I'd go. Oftentimes though, the most important thing is to look at that. They're gonna expect it to be double spaced. So still, right? Yeah, double spaced.
So.
So just really look at those submission guidelines, and then, you know, if in doubt, that's a really basic way to go without getting into any trouble.
And if I offer you one piece of advice I forgot to offer, practice. Practice, practice, practice your pitch. Practice anywhere you can, in your car, to your goldfish, to your mother, to your baby, whoever will listen.
To the pitch lab, too. If you're
Pitch lab, genre sessions, your fellow attendees. Practice.
Cool.
Thank
Thanks,
you
guys.
all. Good night.
This has been the Writers League of Texas podcast. For more information about the Writers League of Texas and our many programs and services for writers, visit our website at writersleague.org. Email us at wlt@writersleague.org or give us a call at 512-499-8914. Thank you for listening.